Today came the announcement, or yesterday I guess it was, that the Trump administration has put North Korea on the list of sponsors of state terrorism. How do you view that decision? Do you think that's the right move to make? What's your take?
Well, ultimately, there has to be a political and diplomatic solution to North Korea. There is no way for a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula to play out without hundreds of thousands, if not millions, dying, and perhaps attacks being launched against U.S. treaty allies, in particular Japan. My worry is that there's a lot of rhetoric from the Trump administration and not a lot of thoughtful planning about how you would take this from a conversation that right now seems to exist in headlines and on social media to a real, true diplomatic conversation between the United States, China, and North Korea. The president's not wrong to make it clear to the North Koreans that we have the military capacity to take them out and that we would respond if they attacked the United States, South Korea, or any of our allies. But we don't have the personnel in place right now to deliver a political agreement. And the president's very open desire to walk away from the Iran nuclear agreement is perhaps the worst thing he could do as he seeks to try to convince Kim Jong-un to enter into another agreement over the future of that country's nuclear program. If we're willing to walk away from the Iran nuclear agreement, it doesn't give the North Koreans any confidence that we would stick to an agreement we signed with them. So, whether or not the designation matters in the long run is dependent on whether the president has any real political strategy to get a deal done. And his lack of interest in putting personnel in the White House and the State Department who actually know the China and Korean Peninsula beat, his misunderstanding of the signal that criticism of the Iran nuclear agreement sends to the North Koreans, makes me worry that there is not ultimately a path here to a diplomatic or political agreement.
So do you reject the Trump administration's strategy? If there is one, part of it is at least keeping the threat of a proactive military strike on the table as an incentive for the North Koreans to de-escalate and to talk.
So, listen, the administration's approach here is not fundamentally wrong. The administration is making clear to the North Koreans that we have the military capacity to take them out. They understand ultimately there's no set of international sanctions that can force the North Koreans to the table without China leading those sanctions, and so they have. They have been very clear with the Chinese that this is that this ultimately has to be an economic sanction strategy that they lead, and they have gotten progress here. I mean, the Chinese have agreed to things at the UN that they had previously not agreed with. They have sent a high-level envoy to the North Korean capital within the last week. So I give the Trump administration credit for moving China in a way that they had not moved prior to 2017. But maybe to your point, the president does not have the power to launch a preemptive strike against North Korea without congressional authorization. And one of the things about the president's strategy that has worried me is that his advisors have suggested that the simple possession of an ICBM-mounted nuclear weapon by the North Koreans would be enough to justify a military strike without congressional authorization. And the president himself has used his Twitter feed to display what I would categorize as a reckless enthusiasm for military action against North Korea. So, I've introduced legislation that simply makes it clear that while the president always has the ability to act if in defense of the United States, given an attack against the United States or the imminent threat of an attack against the United States, absent those two conditions, he does not have the ability to launch a preemptive strike of any kind, a nuclear strike or a conventional strike, without the authorization of Congress.
So you feel that that is not clear without that legislation? So you feel that as of today, he has the authority?
Well, listen, I don't think the president has the authority to do that, but I have heard his advisors suggest that, again, North Korea's possession of an ICBM-mounted nuclear weapon would constitute an imminent threat. So it is generally accepted that the president has the power to launch an attack against a country if the United States is under imminent threat of attack. Now, imminent is a very loosey-goosey word that means something different to me than it does to you. And the administration has suggested that the possession of an ICBM-mounted nuclear weapon would in and of itself constitute an imminent threat, which would put the United States, which would give the president authorization to launch preemptive strikes against a host of nations, Russia amongst them, if that were all of a sudden to constitute an imminent threat. Imminence is very fact dependent, and so it's not really worthwhile to game out what is imminent and what is not. But I do think you can set certain things on the outside of that terminology. Amongst those is the mere possession of that kind of weapon.
So how does the legislation make that, specifies that?
So I mean, listen, again, it's difficult to pre-authorize military action. So all our legislation essentially restates current law. It says that specific to the North Korean threat, the president does not have the ability to launch a military strike unless the United States has been attacked or unless there's an imminent attack. It doesn't attempt to define imminent attack. I tend to think it would be important for Republicans and Democrats to vote for a resolution such as the one we've introduced to make it clear that there is bipartisan concern around how the president may be trying to pervert that term. And again, the president hasn't said this himself. It's been his advisors who have muddled how they would determine whether there was an imminent threat of attack. But it's an important moment to have that conversation. And to Bob Corker's credit, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he convened the first public hearing in decades on the nuclear power of the power of the president to launch a nuclear strike, and that was a really important hearing for us to flesh out some of our concerns.
Anything else on that one? No, a lot of territory to cover. Another thing dominating the news recently of this outpouring of allegations concerning men and their sexual misconduct towards women. It's most recently Senator Al Franken, concerns about his activities. We have someone running for the Senate, Roy Moore, with accusations. So, I'd just like to get your take on this outpouring of concerning information we've had on this topic.
I mean, these allegations are all incredibly concerning. I think it's important that the Senate Ethics Committee is going to launch an investigation into the reports regarding Senator Franken. I think we've got some work to do to clean up our House in Congress. We have learned that there's a fund that has been occasionally used to settle claims against members of Congress that were not made public, and I think we have to take a real hard look at that. You want to protect the identity of accusers, but I don't necessarily know that you should be protecting the identity of those who have settled those claims if they're members of Congress. So this is all very, very serious, and I think it begs Congress to take a look at our own rules to make sure that these complaints are coming forward, to make sure that they're dealt with in a meaningful way, and to make sure that our laws are not protecting individual members, like maybe has been the case, at least in the House of Representatives with that particular fund.
Are you concerned that there's perhaps an unfair equivalency between the kind of accusations we're seeing with Moore and the accusations concerning Senator Franken?
I think anytime there's an accusation like this, it's serious. I don't think it's. So I think anytime there's an allegation, it's serious. I know some people may perceive degrees, but you have to take them all seriously.
I'm going to toss it around the table. Julie, I know we had defense-related questions.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the $700 billion defense authorization bill that passed both the House and Senate, and if you could sort of share what the conversations in Congress are right now about how we're going to pay for that, given that's, it's above what's allowed by law, and sort of what's, I know there's sort of some spending deals that are trying to be worked out. So could you sort of enlighten us on that?
Well, there's no question that we need a serious increase in the overall appropriation for the Defense Department. We have some very expensive programs coming up. In particular, the Columbia-class submarine program that can't be done under the current Department of Defense budget. And so the question we're having is a broader one about how you right-size the Department of Defense budget while also recognizing the need for increases in non-defense programming. I think if you really try to reconcile the national security budget versus the threats that we face abroad, we can't meet those threats with an increase in the Department of Defense budget alone. We have to be increasing the State Department budget by a commensurate amount. But we also, as I've witnessed just today here in Eastern Connecticut, have badly underfunded domestic programs. So we have, a mass transit network here in Eastern Connecticut that is woefully under-resourced. And, you really can't dramatically plus up money for the submarine program if people have no schools and job training programs in order to qualify to do the work, and no mechanism or means of getting to the jobs that will exist either here in Groton and New London or in other parts throughout Eastern Connecticut. So I don't know what the number is going to be in the end, but I think I'm very comfortable continuing to hold to the idea that we need an increase for the Department of Defense. There's no other way for us to afford the programs that we know we need, like the new Columbia-class program, but we also need to plus up non-defense accounts by at least a similar amount to recognize other long underfunded investments that need to be made in this country and in a more holistic understanding of our national security budget.
Are you predicting another continuing resolution to get through the year?
I hope not. I mean, my hope is that we're going to get to work on a budget. The problem is the Republicans are so focused right now on this tax bill that serious negotiations have not begun to happen on the end of year spending package. All of the Republican political capital is tied up in getting this trickle-down tax cut for corporations and the wealthy through, and they are not focused on an end-of-year spending deal. And remember that end of the year has other obstacles as well. We, for instance, have the CHIP program, the Children's Healthcare Insurance Program, which has already expired, and will start to stop payments to states at the end of the year. So there's a lot of end-of-year items that we need to take care of that right now are not getting a lot of attention because the Republicans have all of their focus put on the tax bill.
I know the tax bill is kind of one block in terms of priorities, but I was interested if you could talk a bit about some of the issues where theoretically Democrats and Republicans or Democrats in the Trump administration may find some common ground but haven't. I'm thinking addressing the opioid epidemic, and you talked a lot about Buy American. Those are some issues that Trump has talked about, but there hasn't really been agreement or progress. What do you think are some of the impediments and roadblocks there?
Well, the defense authorization bill weakens Buy America provisions. And so for all of the talk from the administration about buying and hiring in America, they are supporting a defense authorization that actually weakens those protections.
Can you explain how?
So there's it increases some of the thresholds for goods that purchases for which Buy America wouldn't comply. It exempts a few specific renewable energy purchasing programs from Buy America requirements. There's one other, I can get it to you. But there's 3 different ways that act weakens Buy America protections. And similarly on the opioid crisis, it doesn't do any good to declare an opioid state of emergency if you are supporting a healthcare bill that rips insurance away from 30 million Americans, or a tax bill that will require similar substantial reductions in Medicare and Medicaid payments. So I hear a lot of talk from the administration on the opioid epidemic, but I see absolutely no action from them. We can talk a little bit more about this in detail later. A bright spot this last week was a background checks bill introduced by myself and Senator Cornyn and a number of other Republicans and Democrats, Senator Blumenthal amongst them, that is a breakthrough. It's the most significant anti-gun violence legislation introduced by Republicans and Democrats since the Manchin-Toomey bill, which was introduced in the wake of Sandy Hook. And so we have found, amidst this very political and partisan environment, a way to work together on a political hot-button issue, guns. So there are some breakthroughs here and there, but yes, there should be much more cooperation on Buy America, much more cooperation on the opioid epidemic. But I just hear a lot of talk and not a lot of action on those issues, unfortunately.
Can you go into some detail on how you and Senator Cornyn came to agreement on introducing this bill?
So, I've run out of new things to say on the Senate floor after these mass shootings. I'm furious every time one of these things happens, and my colleagues, come down and express their heartfelt sentiments about the victims, but then propose nothing to stop the next tragedy from happening, or the next night set of tragedies from happening. So I decided to come down to the floor, 2 or 3 days after the shooting in Sutherland Springs, and try to remind Republicans that there are some areas where we could cooperate. And so I came down and gave a speech about how badly broken the background check system is. And I talked about this guy who should have been on the list of those prohibited from buying weapons. But I also came down with the spreadsheet showing all of the states that don't upload records onto the national background check system, just to show that this is a very well-known secret, that there are dozens of states that don't upload records onto the national system. It just so happened that John Cornyn was coming down to the floor right after me to give a very similar speech. I think he was, very personally moved by what happened in Sutherland Springs, and maybe he didn't know prior to that massacre about these failings of the system. So he came down to talk about his desire to work on legislation that would clean up some of these problems. And I stayed. He listened to the end of my speech. He then gave his speech. I stayed and listened to his speech. And afterwards, we got together, and he said to me something along the lines of, "Listen, why don't we shock the world and get together and work on something?" And I don't necessarily know that I believed then that we could find common ground, but we spent about a week, our staffs meeting together, and we eventually came up with a bill that now has the support, I think, of 7 Republican senators and 7 Democratic senators. It clearly doesn't go as far as I would like, but it does significantly reorder the incentives and penalties for states and federal agencies to upload records onto the national background check system in a way that we think will lead to hundreds of thousands of new records. It's opposed by some of the gun groups, not the NRA, but some of the other gun groups. It's opposed by some, right-wing conservative groups. So there's no clear path for this bill to passage. But Cornyn is committed to trying to get a vote by the end of the year, and we'll see.
Within that, are there any provisions to address the issues with the military justice system and how they handle records and how those are uploaded as well?
So there's 2 issues within the military justice system. One is that they don't have a specific crime of domestic violence, and so they basically had been punting and not uploading domestic violence crimes onto the national database because they couldn't separate out which assaults would be disqualifying and which wouldn't. Not every single assault puts you on the list of those that can't buy guns. So I know Senator Blumenthal is sort of looking for a Republican to work with him on making clear there needs to be a specific domestic violence charge in the military criminal code. But that doesn't excuse the military. So the military, even under existing law, has a responsibility to match up their convictions with the list of convictions that should put you on the federal list and upload those records. So our bill sets forth a new set of penalties against all federal agencies, including the military, if they don't comply. And yes, it does require some work on the military's part to look through all of their assault convictions, match that up with the assault convictions that would prohibit you from buying a weapon, and upload those to the national database. But now, if they don't do that under our law, there will be consequences to those agencies and personal consequences to some of the heads of those agencies, and we think that will get them working to fix the problem.
Do you see any prospect for passage? It's one thing to introduce a bill, another thing to get it passed.
I mean, Senator Cornyn is really committed to this bill. This was not for him just a matter of putting out a press release. He has had active conversations with, as I understand, he's had active conversations with Senator McConnell and with Chuck Grassley, the head of the Judiciary Committee, to see if we can get this bill to the floor, by the end of the year. Assuming that all Democrats support it, you would need 12 Republicans to break a filibuster. We have 7 Republican co-sponsors right now. So we're more than half the way there just with co-sponsors. And we've never had 7 Republican co-sponsors of a gun bill in the Senate before. So that suggests that this is something different, that this is a different moment. And listen, I think it's partially because of Senator Cornyn's reaction to what happened in Texas, but I also think the politics on this issue are changing. If you look at the Virginia election, and if you look at those exit polls, the number 1 issue which drove voters to the polls in Virginia was health care. The number 2 issue which drove voters to the polls was guns. And it was number 2 for both Republicans and Democrats. So now, obviously, they were driven for different reasons. Republicans were driven to the polls because they thought the Democrat was going to take away their guns. But 16% of Democrats said their number 1 issue was guns, who came to vote for Ralph Northam, who was pro-universal background check, pro-assault weapons ban. So I think Republicans are beginning to realize that their obstinance on this issue, their refusal to do anything after mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting, is turning this issue into a real motivator for Democratic turnout. And I think that Republicans, from just a political perspective, are realizing that they need to be at least 1 or 2 tables, or this is going to start to really hurt them in elections.
David, I think you had a question.
Yeah. Given what we now know about Russian influence in the last election, how confident are you that it won't happen in the next election? And if I can make that a twofer, what do you anticipate your election to look like?
I think the Russians are still at it. And given the fact that the President of the United States, depending on the day, admits or denies their interference in the 2016 election, I don't have a great deal of confidence that there's going to be a coordinated response from the federal government about making sure it doesn't happen again. As late as this summer, Jeff Sessions was testifying that he hadn't had a single conversation with the president about the Russian interference, which suggests that the Department of Justice isn't engaged in any serious planning to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So I'm deeply worried about it. I mean, I know that at the state level we're taking additional steps to make sure that our voter file, which does exist online, can't be targeted by the Russians, but it's difficult to do that without a real federal commitment here and without a message being delivered from the President of the United States, to Vladimir Putin, that there will be consequences if they do it again. And my impression is that by not bringing it up in high-level communications with the Russians, we're sending the wrong signal.
Do you think Congress gets some of the blame for allowing this to go unchecked for this long into the next election cycle?
I mean, Congress could certainly be doing a lot more. We could be standing up, new capacities to help states try to push back. I do think that the social media sites, which bear responsibility here, have begun to change their practices, and they've done that in response to Democratic and Republican pressure. So, in Congress, there's lots of Republicans who care deeply about this issue and have been joining with Democrats to put pressure on the internet companies. I think it's significant that we now require RT and Sputnik to register as foreign agents here in the United States. It was pretty remarkable to me to be flipping by along the dial in Washington, D.C. about a month ago and realize that 105.5, one of the most powerful stations in Washington, D.C., had been taken over by Russian propaganda. So Russian propaganda is now streaming full-time on a major radio station in Washington, D.C., and they didn't need to get registered as a foreign agent in order to take over that station. Now they would for future purchases of radio TV capacity.
So you think Facebook and Twitter can police themselves without strong regulations?
No. I think that the Congress has to step into the breach here, and but I just want to acknowledge that they have taken some steps to get more serious about this than they were in the 2016 election.
And I think there was a part 2 of your question about the election.
How does your re-election campaign look?
I'm not really focused on it right now. I'm sure I will once 2018 comes into view. Obviously, I'm raising money in anticipation of re-election. I know there are a couple of Republican candidates. I assume there'll be more, and I'm just going to kind of keep my head down and hope that by doing a good job, that'll be a good advertisement in and of itself for re-election when the time comes.
You've become one of the faces of the loyal opposition. I think the news networks are one of the people they call when they want to get the other side of an issue, and that's raised your profile to the point where you're on the presidential discussion list. Can you talk about that and whether you would consider that?
I'm not interested in running for president. I'm interested in being a great senator from Connecticut, and I think this is an exceptional moment in time right now where you need to step up and show real leadership, given the stakes. When they're threatening to pull healthcare away from hundreds of thousands of Connecticut residents, I think I've got to fight that fight on a national basis. When we have a president who, cavalierly talks about going to war in North Korea, I've got to step up and fight that fight on a national basis. But, to me, that's in service of the people that I represent here in Connecticut. And, I understand that I've been on, some of these lists for 2020, but that's not, that's nothing that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about running for re-election and being a great U.S. Senator from Connecticut.
What kind of candidate do you think the Democrats should put up? I know you were an early supporter of Hillary. I mean, would you like to see another woman run?
I just think it's too early. I mean, we haven't even, we're not even through the first year of Trump's presidency. I know that everybody wants to, game out the presidential election as soon as the last one is done. I imagine we'll have a really big field. I think there'll be some good friends of mine from the Senate that are in that field, but I just think it's too early for our party to start thinking about candidates in 2020. I think we've got to focus on 2018, where we have a very good chance to pick up the House, pick up some seats in the Senate, and that's where I think our focus should be.
If you wouldn't mind putting on your prediction hat, do you think the tax cut bill will pass the Senate? And do you think Donald Trump will be running again?
I think that the Republicans are desperate to pass anything. It is remarkable that we are at Thanksgiving, and with control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, the Republicans have passed zero legislation of any. We passed a Russian sanctions bill. They've passed some smaller bills overturning late Obama era regulations. But of all of the top priority issues that the Republicans started the year with, they haven't passed any of them into legislation. So I think they're desperate, but I think their desperation is misplaced. I think they've convinced themselves that the very bad election results for them earlier this month was due to the fact that they haven't passed anything. And I would argue that the very bad election results for them earlier this month was due to the fact that their policies are widely unpopular, including their tax proposal, in which the vast majority of all of the money that they are borrowing in order to cut taxes are going to the very wealthy and to corporations. Corporations that will use that money to buy back stock, to give, to pay down debt, and to give CEOs increased pay, not to invest in their workers. So if they do pass this bill, I think they'll be in even bigger electoral trouble going into 2018. But if I had to guess, I think it's a 50-50 proposition. They have all the same problems on the tax bill that they had on the health care bill because they're refusing to work with Democrats. They have no margin for error, and they always are going to have one or two or three Senate Republicans who are uncomfortable with their proposal. But I know that they are more desperate to pass this than they were even to pass the health care bill, and so I don't put it past them to try to that they might be able to squeak something out.
If they fail in that effort, do you see any prospects for bipartisan tax reform, and what might it look like if you had a chance to be a part of that?
I think the great tragedy here is that they didn't start by doing this in a bipartisan way. There are some lines that it would be difficult for Democrats to cross, but I think there's plenty of potential common agreement. I don't have any interest in a deficit-financed tax cut. So I think Democrats start with the premise that if you're going to lower taxes for somebody, you have to find another way to make up for that money. I don't have a lot of interest in tax cuts for the richest 1%. I have a lot of constituents here in Connecticut who could use some tax relief, but they tend to be people that are making $50,000 or $100,000, not $1 million. And if we're doing corporate tax relief, I'd like to do it in a way that provides some incentives for those corporations to take that money and spend it on capital and infrastructure and their workers rather than just on stock buybacks. So I think there's room for us to agree on middle class tax cuts, on the right kind of corporate tax cut, on tax simplification. And I think that room still exists. We showed that in the wake of the failure of the healthcare repeal bill, that we could work together. The Senate, has a bill that has 60 votes that makes some, meaningful adjustments to the healthcare system today that would stabilize these exchanges. I think we could do the same thing on taxes.
With healthcare, it was kind of looked at that if that had failed, next up is the tax plan. If the tax bill fails as well, do you see kind of another issue that Republicans would come forward with just to have a victory or major legislation passing?
That's a great question. We continue to, think that there's a chance that the president might get serious about infrastructure, but he hasn't shown any willingness to put that on the legislative calendar, and there doesn't seem to be much interest from McConnell and Ryan to take up infrastructure, but there's always been a big bipartisan deal to be had on infrastructure. Listen, there are some Democrats that will not work or cooperate with Trump on anything because they hate him so much that they loathe his politics so much that they don't want to give him any political win. I abhor much of Trump's politics. But if he were to reach out to me on something that made my constituents' life better, I'd be eager to work with him. And infrastructure would be on that list. So maybe that's a place they would go if they failed here. But they're running out of they're running out of priorities.
What do Democrats have to do to try to win back the high school educated white working class voters that once used to be kind of a bread and butter part of the party, but which Trump capitalized on, was able to get their votes? What's the message Democrats have to bring to the electorate to try to win back that vote?
Well, we have to be hyper focused on economic messaging and an economic messaging that is meaningful and recognizes that the current system is rigged against people who are of lower income or people who have lower educational attainment. And Trump was right when he told people that the system was rigged. Now his ideas were backwards and reckless and unhelpful, but incremental policy change on the economy doesn't speak to voters who have seen their wages flat for the last decade. I didn't support Bernie Sanders in the primary, but Bernie had it right in the sense that he was proposing some big radical ideas to change our economy. One of them is free college. I think we should be a party that supports a new guarantee of public education through 16th grade and one free retraining for anybody in this country that has their job eliminated because of globalization or technological change. I just don't understand why we don't recognize that the only way to save this country's economy is to have a workforce that is better trained and better educated than the rest of the world, and to have a nimble training system that quickly gets people retrained after their job has become obsolete. And it's that kind of easy to understand radical economic idea that people are looking for. Trump had these radical ideas: put a wall up all around the country, engage in a trade war with the Chinese. People understood those ideas. They were bad ideas, but people understood them. We've got to have some big, easy to understand economic ideas as well.
How do you square the juxtaposition in Connecticut of the two parties on the local level, the national level? We have a completely Democratic delegation to Congress, and yet the Republicans have made great gains in the legislature and are almost on a par with the Democrats running the legislature. It seems like such a mixed message to, I would think, people running for office as to where the loyalties lie of the voters.
Yeah, well, I think some of the issues that have driven Connecticut voters to vote Democratic at the federal level are more are issues that don't show up at the state capitol in the way that they show up nationally. A lot of voters started voting Democrat around the Iraq War in Connecticut and stuck with it. A lot of voters at the federal level vote Democratic because of social issues, which are more present in Washington than they are at the state capitol. So I think the divisions between Republicans and Democrats are bigger ideologically in Washington than they are in Hartford or in state government, and that probably drives that dichotomy. At the same time, we still do have a Democratic governor, all Democrats in statewide elected offices, still nominally a Democratic-controlled state legislature. And at the local level, local politics are just much more personal. Partisan labels just don't matter as much at the local level, which I think speaks to why you have more Republicans elected at the local level.
Both kind of going back in the earlier discussion, both Senator Standards and President Trump during the campaign kind of made a whipping boy of free trade. Both opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with this newspaper supported, and Secretary Clinton sort of joined in on that later in the campaign. Where do you stand on free trade? Do you see it as sort of the enemy of the working person, and why the factories closed, et cetera?
So I think why free trade agreements are so unpopular in the United States is due to the fact that we have given no resources to we have not given enough resources to individuals in this country to withstand globalization. I think people understand that the economy is global today. They understand why certain jobs have moved from the United States abroad. They are just deeply resentful that they haven't been given the opportunity to survive those transitions. A college degree is 300% more expensive today than it was in 1980. In real dollars. Job training opportunities are few and far between today for workers. And so if you give workers the ability to transition, then there'll be more public support for these trade agreements. And so my opposition to trade agreements in the past has been linked to I think that failing, but also to the fact that there have been woven into these trade agreements some really favorable provisions to multinational corporations that I think we have to think seriously about. This international dispute mechanism that was going to be in the TPP agreement, is a really terrible idea. And in the end, I didn't announce a position for or against TPP. I was still studying it, but I was, certainly frustrated by the fact that I thought some big multinational corporations had done very well in that, and very frustrated by the fact that we weren't giving workers the means to survive some of the transitions that would happen in the wake of those agreements. Good. And I think there's agreements that are, potentially really good for Connecticut. There's a European free trade agreement that was being negotiated by the Obama administration, that was shelved by the Trump administration. That, obviously, I would wait to see what it looked like in the end. But that's a trade relationship in which Europe is not undercutting us on labor prices or on environmental policies. It's a continent where Connecticut does 40% of its existing export work, and knocking down some of the tariff and non-tariff barriers with Europe, I think, would have been really positive for Connecticut, notwithstanding the questions about transitional benefits for workers.
Sort of the perceived debate in the Democratic Party is now between the centrist, moderate, sort of Clinton-era Lieberman embodies that, as opposed to the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, more progressive wing in the party. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the debate that's happening within the Democratic Party, and where does Senator Murphy stand on that scale in that discussion?
I don't think it is. I mean, I think everybody wants an easy way to explain, where Democrats sit and stand, and it's not that simple. In the end, Bernie's rhetoric was different, but if you and he had some, as I mentioned, very big, very simple to understand ideas, but there was a lot of really groundbreaking progressive policy in Hillary Clinton's campaign, which she maybe didn't articulate as well as Bernie Sanders. But yeah, I don't put myself in a particular place on the ideological spectrum writ large or within the Democratic Party. Like I said, I agree with Bernie that we should have universal college in this country. I come down on a little different place on healthcare than he does. I have not signed on.
You didn't sign on to the one payer?
I didn't sign on to single payer. I'm working on my own proposal, which I hope to introduce in the next few weeks, that would allow for every American to buy into Medicare. I think we're probably better off if we allow consumers to make the choice as to whether they want to be in Medicare or not. And I think if you gave them that choice, they'd probably choose to be in Medicare, but it'd be better off to let them decide. So, I just sort of take it, I take it issue by issue.
Could you talk about, you seem to be at polar opposites with this administration on the State Department, the Foreign Service. The Trump administration has been shrinking the Foreign Service, leaving many positions vacant. You would like to see just the opposite. You'd like to see a far more aggressive use of diplomacy and the State Department and the Foreign Service. So could you talk about that and the difficulty in getting traction for your policy suggestion?
Listen, I think one of the most bizarre, inexplainable things happening in this administration is this open warfare against the State Department. I cannot explain where this administration's motivation comes from to wage this very purposeful battle against diplomats in the State Department. I mean, I could go. It's not just that the hiring freeze, which at the beginning of the administration applied to every department, now only applies to one department, the State Department. So why is that? Why are the early retirement and buyouts happening only in the State Department? Why have they stopped the ability for spouses to transfer efficiently with their spouse inside the department? I mean, it's just there's a very specific hostile treatment of State Department employees that doesn't exist anywhere else. And I don't know what the reason for that is. My contention is that if you really categorize all of the threats presented to the United States today, yes, there are several that are conventional military threats, like Iran and Russia and North Korea, but there are more that are not conventional military threats, like propaganda and energy-rich petro-dictators and corruption and pandemic disease and global warming. The State Department is the place that pushes back against those non-military threats that are presented to the United States. And so I argue that you should be doubling the State Department's budget to recognize the myriad of non-military threats. And I don't understand why this administration doesn't see the world in the way that I see the world, in the way that Lindsey Graham sees the world, in the way that Bob Corker sees the world. I mean, there's lots of Republicans and Democrats who are supportive of a major increase in the State Department budget, and the administration is, for some reason, going in the opposite direction.
Given the investigation of the administration and the campaign, the Trump campaign, and the possible collusion with Russia, what's your impression of the administration's relationship with Russia and Trump's relationship with Putin?
I mean, I have no way to unpack his relationship with Putin. I mean, he has, delivered Putin much of what he wants. He's given him a weakened State Department. He's offered no substantive pushback on their interference in the 2016 election. He's outsourced the problem of Syria to Moscow. He's dramatically downsized the bully pulpit on human rights and corruption. At the same time, he did sign the new sanctions bill. The State Department did take some independent action to restrict Russian diplomats' access to certain of their facilities here. So I don't understand what the nature of that relationship is, but it certainly isn't accruing to the benefit of the United States right now. Russia's influence is expanding by the day. In the Middle East, throughout the world. I mean, little covered was a massive new weapons agreement between the Russians and Saudi Arabia. I mean, the president went over to Saudi Arabia and ushered in this new era of unconditional cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And apparently that wasn't enough for the Saudis to not do a massive military deal with the Russians, despite the fact that we have sanctions against the Russian government pending. So I don't really know what the United States is getting out of the U.S.-Russia relationship right now.
Kind of two-part question. One, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Should the White House be doing more to deal with the blockade we're seeing in Yemen and the human suffering that's causing? And two, should the Senate have Secretary Tillerson to ask him why is this our approach to the State Department, and find out if there is some method to this approach?
Yeah, this blockade is a humanitarian disaster. It is counterproductive to Saudi Arabia's national security. needs. This administration has the ability to put an end to this blockade if we wanted, and we choose not to. And my understanding is that there's disagreement inside the administration over this question, that this is the White House that's choosing not to send a strong message to the Saudis. I don't understand the reasons for this embrace of the Saudis by this administration. You have 1 million cases of cholera today inside Yemen. They are all man-made because what's happened is that the bombing that has happened of the electricity grid and the water treatment facilities have meant that they can't treat the sewage. And so sewage is just running raw throughout the country, and it's infected 1 million people with cholera. And meanwhile, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, our mortal enemies, are getting stronger inside Yemen by the day. So, as you know, I've introduced a number of resolutions to cut off military sales to Saudi Arabia. In 2016, I got 21 votes for a resolution. About 3 months ago, I got 47 votes. I think if I offered a resolution on the floor today, it would pass. There's not a pending military sale to Saudi Arabia, but at some point, Congress has to take control of this relationship and start playing tough with the Saudis, because they and us are contributing to a humanitarian nightmare right now in Yemen.
And on the second point, you say you don't know, you can't understand the approach to the State Department. Should Tillerson be pushed on that? Should the administration be pushed on that? The Senate would, I think, have the authority to bring him before the appropriate committee and find out, why are we doing this?
I mean, we have. He's been before the Appropriations Committee. We've had private audiences with him. The case he makes is that the bureaucracy at the State Department is bloated, and that as a corporate manager, he knows how to do more with less. That doesn't explain why this disparate treatment occurs in the State Department versus other departments. So he's got an answer. It's just not a very satisfactory answer. Listen. I mean, if I was Russia and I was running U.S. foreign policy, I would be dismantling the State Department. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not alleging that that's happening, but if I were the Kremlin and I had control of U.S. foreign policy, I would be cutting the State Department, because it's the State Department that provides the sort of most significant daily pushback against the Russian government. The Department of Defense is ultimately our defense against the Russians if they were ever to move on us or our allies, but on a daily basis, it's the State Department that's giving them trouble.
During the Watergate era, there was a consensus reached that the Congress would take the steps necessary, depending on where the evidence led, concerning the misconduct of the president. Sitting in the Senate, do you get the sense that this Congress would be willing to do what's necessary if the evidence so leads them there?
I do. I have enough private conversations with Republicans to, have a sense of their seriousness about a potential constitutional crisis. If they have supported Mueller's investigation in the Senate, at least, without exception. Several Republican senators have offered legislation that would protect Mueller in the case of interference from the White House. Senator McConnell has said several times that he, supports the continued investigation. I think that Republicans genuinely want to know what happened in the 2016 election, what the president knew, and I trust that they'll take the necessary action if what Mueller delivers to us is, truly explosive.
Do you believe we're heading to a constitutional crisis?
I don't know. There's so many different fact patterns that Mueller could potentially present to Congress. Obviously there's no. Impeachment is not a legal standard; it's a political standard, and so it's difficult to define ahead of time. I hope that there is not evidence presented to Congress that would warrant impeachment. I don't wish for that on the president or on the country, and I think it's hard to predict what he's going to deliver. But the pace of the investigation, the pace of the indictments suggests that he's not even close to done, and that should be very worrying for every American. I'm not somebody that celebrates these indictments, and yet I want to get to the truth, and I think most Republicans in the Congress.
Are you satisfied with the pace of the Senate and House investigations?
No, but I think they were. The truth was never going to come from the House and Senate investigations. The intelligence committees are not set up to be investigative bodies. They are not staffed with prosecutors and investigators. I think it was important for us to, do our due diligence and set up a process, but it's always been Mueller and his team that was going to get to the bottom of this, and I think that's where our focus needs to be, on protecting that investigation and giving him all the resources that he needs. And again, so far, with the exception of a couple House Republicans and some of the conservative websites, I've seen solidarity in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats on that question of supporting Mueller.
I know we're getting to the hour. I just want to ask you, or hope you'd be willing to, when the Republicans come up with an opponent, that you'd be willing to come down for a day-sponsored debate in the area. We know you participate in a very interesting debate in your first election for the Senate over at the Guard Arts Center. So we're hoping that you'll be so inclined again when we get to that cycle.
I'll look forward to talking to you guys about it. So,
all right.
Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.